The first of three steps in cellular respiration is called glycolysis. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of cells and results in the breakdown of glucose from a single 6-carbon molecule to two 3-carbon molecules called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid is also sometimes called pyruvate. This process yields a little bit of energy in the form of 2 ATPs, which cells can use, and 2 NADHs. These electron carriers can carry electrons to processes that can make ATP, but NADH in that form is not usable directly by cells and has to be further processed. In a little more detail, here's what happens in glycolysis. There are 2 steps of glycolysis indicated here by 2 arrows. In the first step, energy gets invested in the form of 2 ATPs that have to be spent in order to kickstart the reaction. So we call this first step the energy investment phase. In the second step, we get the payoff of energy. Instead of putting energy in, we get energy out in the form of 4 ATPs and 2 NADHs. So we call this the payoff phase of glycolysis. All right, so in that first energy investment phase, energy is required because this reaction, even though it releases energy, does have activation energy required. So if you recall, you learned that reactants and products can hold different amounts of energy because of the arrangement of the chemical bonds between the atoms. And in glycolysis, we go from the reactant glucose to the products by releasing energy. However, a little bit of activation energy is required for this reaction to occur. So in addition to the energy released by the reaction, a little bit more activation energy is required. And so cells put in 2 ATPs. That's the cost of getting that reaction started, but as a result of it, they're able to harvest 4 ATPs and 2 NADHs. Right. Okay, so in step 2, that harvest happens to produce 2 pyruvic acids. There's one last thing I want to point out about this reaction, and that is what these intermediates are. They're not named here, but it turns out that these 2 3-carbon molecules, which have a lot of energy in it, high energy, because not only have they all the energy of glucose, they have additional energy from those additional 2 ATPs. These high energy molecules are named G3P, and in fact, it's the same molecule that is produced by photosynthesis. So it's something that these 2 processes have in common. Okay, so a little bit of energy is harvested from the from the G3Ps to produce pyruvic acid. So these are still pretty high energy, but not quite as high as G3P. And that is glycolysis. This reaction, glycolysis, happens without any oxygen requirements. And so when cells, either temporarily or by virtue of living in oxygen-free environments, are without oxygen, um, cells can still get a little bit of energy simply by doing glycolysis. And the little bit of energy they get is the 2 ATP that result from this reaction. Because remember, we spend 2 and get 4, so we net 2 ATPs. Cells that are without oxygen cannot use the 2 NADHs. As I said, those require further processing, and that processing requires oxygen. So the result is that those essentially have to be recycled, and the process of recycling is called fermentation, which is the subject of a different lesson. So what we're going to do now is go to the second step of glycolysis, assuming that oxygen is present. And that will take us into the mitochondrion.